Others, he's and she's, welcome to my anime podcast.
And we're coming off some of the best animation we've ever seen just on this list. Mob Psycho, One Punch Man. But this just blew them out of the water with everything else. And I think it really cracked open my understanding of the medium, because I think until this point I was of the mind that anime was this, had this conception of it as something that was thrilling, and it was like full of action, and it could be cute, and it could be funny, but I don't think I'd ever experienced a truly dramatic masterpiece in the medium. And this was it. Like you said, you stack this up next to anything and it'll hold its weight, that's for sure.
Welcome all to this latest edition of my anime podcast. This 113th edition of my anime podcast. How are you today, dear listeners? And how are you today, dear co-host, on this finest of mornings, afternoons / evenings in Mananamaland?
I'm doing all right. Feeling a bit swamped at work, but you know, all said and done, there was a known barrier to re-entry, if you know what I mean. We're coming off a vacation, so it's always rough. How about you?
Likewise, there's always a bit of an adjustment period, and my body hasn't got completely adjusted to that period, but it's getting there. Case in point, me having a nap before we started this thing. That's not ideal, because I'll be paying for that later on when I'll be wide awake. It's morning. But right now, I'm feeling fine. Work was fine. Got through half the week so far. We're over hump day, which is good, because we are recording this on a Wednesday.
Whoa.
I think we can count the number of Wednesday recordings we've ever done on one finger, as in one finger. This is the first one we've ever done. I know we've had the odd Monday or Tuesday, and we had a Friday once upon a time, but never a Wednesday. It's almost dangerous, you would say. Unprecedented for a 113th occasion, as we go back to talk about the opening 38 episodes of the podcast and Retrograde, the anime that we covered from that period. So I predict this being quite a busy affair, kind of like the Crunchyroll Anime Awards nominations, where we're just sort of rattling through things, dropping numbers, talking about anime left, right, and center, dropping titles left, right, and center. So hopefully it's not too confusing for you. I will say this, though, that the shows that we are covering for this first chunk are relatively well-known shows. It's not quite Nemo's Adventures in Slumberland or something off the beaten track in terms of its anime status in the world. These are like big anime touchstones. Do you have any thoughts about these opening 10 shows? And I mean more so how they related to the opening 38 episodes of the podcast itself. Just to explain which shows we're going through, I'm going to call this opening batch of shows that we're talking about the Tetsu era. And these are 10 of the 11 shows that we covered from episode 1 to episode 38, which was Tetsu's run with the podcast. This also encompasses book 1 or chapter 1 or season 1 in the My Anime podcast. At this point, we were still called Roy Animator Pod. And I'm imagining at this point, most people who are listening now were not listening then, with very few exceptions. Back then, it was kind of the Wild West of My Anime podcast in terms of you didn't really know who was listening, and we were kind of learning as we went. So there was a lot of moving goalposts, moving parts, and shifting tactics and approaches to everything. The highlights of this for me would have been having Brains on to debate Naraku. That was
That was a good one.
That's one that really stuck out to me. Maybe our first ever Rolling Reviews, which later went on to become, I think they were still called Rolling Reviews for a long time.
And then they became just, let's get rid of the good ones and make them all bad.
Yeah, and let's do them a hell of a lot less frequently, because there was a lot of bad. And those early reviews, I'm not going to lie, are pretty bad. I had to listen to my one about a year ago, I'll say, on a whim and a whips and a whimsy. And it wasn't great. It wasn't great. I'm not going to lie. I feel like I could definitely do a better job of that now, but no promises, because that is not an inconsiderable task. I have one other thing I really did notice, and that was the fact that we only covered 11 shows. Like, canonically, in those opening 38 episodes, it felt like we just watched all the anime.
All the anime, all the time. There were a lot of individual shows. Like,
there was.
We were doing these roll-in reviews, and we were doing like, oh, you've seen this, tell us about it. Yeah, it was a lot of people on different pages. You've affectionately called them the Tetsu years, and my memories are pretty fond. I think we had good times, for sure.
I would say it was like definitely less, I can't say professional, because the last year has not really been a beacon of professionality, but I would say that it was definitely less assured in terms of producing a podcast each week, or each episode, we'll say. Now there's sort of a tried and tested formula in terms of like how things work. You know what I mean? I'll sit down, I'll cut through some bits and bobs, put together something that I think is a fair encapsulation of the discussion that we had, and then it will get off to Gary. Gary will do his thing like a chicken wing, send it back to me. I'll do a few more touches, add some music in, and it's almost like muscle memory at this point. Where back then it was like week to week, you're just trying new things, trying new experiments, trying to make something cohesive and whole. And it was definitely like, I'm trying to be kind, charming in its sort of a rough around the edges-ness.
Rough around the edges, wet behind the ears. Yeah, we were pretty new at the whole anime thing. And I will say that the shows that we watched were quite popular, quite big, and I think our ratings of them now and then are probably different. So like we are retrogradedly grading. We are retrograding them.
I thought you were going to do like a Ned Flanders impression there. Retro-diddly. Hardy ho, neighbory knows.
But we are grading them in a way that we never would have graded them back then, because we just weren't as refined and we didn't have as much of an experience to relate them to actually give them viable grades.
The grading back then was a classic reanimator pod grading of a letter grade, right? Which was something that we toyed with back in early days before like getting actually started, about having sort of like a school classroom environment. Like the idea of, oh, these guys have watched anime. He's a noob. Here they're hilarious weekly podcast talking about anime. At the time, it felt like a semi-original idea. It's not. I've seen that format about a million times. So we had letter grades. I know personally there was occasions where you're like, it comes to you and you're like, oh, sure, a B.
A B. Why not? Yeah.
Simple as that. I feel like I was never too far off the mark in terms of like my feelings on it. So I feel like with the actual gradings, when you have a lot of time to think about it, and it's almost taken out of your hands by the nature of the format, that you don't have the same irresponsible grading. The only one that I maybe felt I was a little bit harsh on might have been Carol and Tuesday. I don't know. Maybe I just woke up on the wrong side of the bed that day. And I definitely didn't like it. But I don't think I hated it as much as it came across. 100 episodes down the line, we'll see. Maybe I'm like, you know what? The thing I regret the most is taking a big steaming dump on Carol and Tuesday. Right in their chest.
A lot of the dump was out of the ear of what we said more than the grading. I mean, it was one thing that we had a lot of bad things to say. And that I think we were just like disappointed on a lot of fronts. But the grade wasn't actually terrible. And as you'll see today, there are going to be worse shows.
That's definitely the case. And if it's not today, spoiler, it is today. But just to keep you interested, it'll definitely come. There's going to be waves once we move off the more safe path, and that will happen soon, things are going to get a little bit more rocky. The only two things that we need to do before we hop into this. One is a quick promo plug. Go to myanimepodcast.com. Over there, you'll find all our social media links. Give us a like, give us a follow. Get in touch with us. Let us know that you agree with us or disagree with us. Maybe we can get a sort of feedback loop going, and that could be an element of future podcasts. That'd be nice, right? Having your actual voice as opposed to an inferred voice. You can also go to any of your podcast catchers and leave a 5-star review. It really is appreciated. We will love you forever and ever, and there's nothing more I can say. It really, really helps in visibility. It helps with the show getting promoted, and it helps with all those algorithmic goodnesses that run these mercurial sites, these mysterious voids called podcast catching sites such as Stitcher, Spotify, and the all-important iTunes. You can also head on over to Yasakun on YouTube. Give me a subscribe there. Check out the latest video. And you can follow My Anime Podcast on Twitch. Gaijin Gary is there, and he's doing his thing on the regular. If you want to come hang out, it'd be a little bit more informal. You can head on over to the Discord. You'll find the Discord invite link on myanimepodcast.com, as well as all the other important links. So go head over there now. Our second piece of urgent business is to explain the format. If you're a long-time listener of the podcast, you probably know the format quite intimately by now, but I'm sure not everyone does. Or I'm maybe exaggerating how intimately familiar people are with this grading system. It's been in effect for about a year or so, but it's always good to refresh the memory. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Taka, and he's going to give us a sample breakdown through a previous review of ours, which was Promare, the Studio Trigger movie from 2019.
Yeah, so we've got Promare up as an example. And just to round this out, we are doing a 5-point rating system. So kind of the classic 5 out of 5 stars. How did you like it? And we're breaking it into 5 different categories. So the My Anime Podcast categories are characters, plot, visual art, sound, and enjoyment. And then both Yata and I will give our score out of 5 for each of these categories. Those scores will then be averaged together at the end to form a My Anime Podcast score out of 5. And that is the average of both Yata and my thoughts on each show. Now, for each category, character is a little bit subjective. It's how much we enjoyed the characters, but also how dynamic, interesting, likable we thought they were. And that goes for, villains and protagonists, side characters, all the characters in the show. And for plot, we're trying to be as objective as possible. But again, a lot of this is going to tie into enjoyment, but there is a full category for enjoyment at the end where we can kind of place our final mark. But for plot, we're really looking at, is it a well-written story? How did the script go? How was the dialogue handled? What about the pacing? Things like that stood out as either really great or bad. For visual art, we are looking at character design, animation, background art, kind of rounding those all together for one score. For sound, again, it's pulling from a few different things. We've got voice acting, OSTs, as well as openings and EDs. Those are all factored in. And then enjoyment is just that. It is our subjective thoughts on the show, how much this all blended together. And sometimes you get poor scores all the way down, but you still enjoyed it for some reason. And that's what this category is all about. It's to make up for those differences in the numbers and the feel of the show. So at the end, we have a final score. So just as an example, Promare, Yata gave it a 3 in characters, 3.5 in plot, a 5 in visual art, a 5 in sound, a 3 in enjoyment for a total score of 19.5. And I gave the characters a 3, the plot 3.5, the visual art a 5 out of 5, the sound a 5 out of 5, and the enjoyment a 3.5 for a total score of 20. Then we'll add those up and divide them by 10, and we'll get a score that is very nebulously done in all the background math and come out with a 3.95 out of 5 stars. And that is our My Anime Podcast rating for Promare.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. There are 10 shows on the docket for today, and they will be the ones that we covered for the opening 38 episodes. So quick rundown before we start what we got on the agenda for today. We hop to episode 8 of My Anime Podcast, then Reanimator Pods, Yuri on Ice. We then move to Tokyo Ghoul for episode 11, our first Halloween special. And the very next episode, episode 12, we had Tokyo Ghoul Root of A. We hop to episode 15 for One Punch Man. And episode 16 for Mob Psycho 100. Then we move to episode 19. We have Erased. This was the first of our 4 episode breakdowns of a single series. Erased was the first show to ever have that pleasure. We then move to episode 22. We have Shogen Roku Rakugu Shinju. This was the Naraku introduction arc. This is when he first made his appearance. We then move to episode 30 for Made in Abyss. We have 2 more. Our first movie on the docket is A Silent Voice from episode 33. That was the Naoko Yamada episode. And the show rounding out today's proceedings is My Hero Academia Season 1 from episode 38.
And we'll also try to call out the episode right after we do it, just in case you really want to go back and hear our original thoughts. They'll obviously be a lot more fleshed out than what we're doing today and a lot fresher.
All right, without further ado and any much more to do, I'm going to throw over to Taka, and Taka's going to talk about Yuri on Ice.
All right, Yuri on Ice was from episode 8. For the characters, I gave them a 4.5, and Yata gave them a 4.5 as well, so we were both pretty hot on those. Plot, I gave it a 3.5. Yata gave it a 3.0, so I was a little higher on the plot. Visual art, we were both at 3.0s. For sound, you gave it a 4.5, and I gave it a 4.0. And enjoyment, we were both at a solid 5 out of 5. We love this one. For total score of 4.0.
Yes. We diverged at some points, but ended up in the same spot. We both ended with a 20.0 rating, which ended up at a 4.0 for Yuri on Ice. And I feel like a 4 out of 5 is perfect.
Yeah, it's very fitting. And it's a good starting step so that everything else can kind of be more or less compared to this show that we both thought was very enjoyable and had its very obvious flaws. I mean, it wasn't the most stunning animation. It wasn't the greatest groundbreaking plot, but it was just so much fun and had just an amazingly memorable cast as well as OP. I mean, if we weren't singing that on air back then, we would probably be singing it now.
We did sing it on air back then.
We did.
Yeah. It's cringy as hell, but it was a thing that happened. That's one of those things you look back and a part of you wants to just like, oh, let's just make that never happen. Let's like Thanos that moment.
It's history.
Yeah. This was back in 2018 when we did this. So this is actually 3 years ago. Now, what are your memories of?
Really what sticks out are the performances, and not because they were so well animated or visually stunning or anything like that. It was just, you really felt for the characters, right? The character arcs were done very well. And what I mean by that are obviously the Yuris and the Victor being the main characters, but the side characters were just as well put together. And that's what really stands out to me when I think back at this show. I just loved watching these characters interact and grow and go through their emotional ups and downs. Hearing that to music and put to choreography was just icing on the cake.
And I think even back then we were talking about very much anticipated follow-up sequel or movie.
We're still waiting.
Still waiting. That's like the joke with this one. And it's not like other shows where you're like, it may or may not get a sequel. This movie's been slated for God knows how long. Yeah, there's a trailer out there. I've seen the trailer of young Victor and I'm excited for it. I can't wait to return to that world again. I think you're right. The characters were the obvious highlight when you look at the scores. Both of us gave it a 4.5. My second high rating score was in the sound department. I think the sound for this was great. The actors' performances were very, very solid to great in different places. The guy who played Yurio was amazing. But on top of that, you had these great musical numbers that were within the show itself. Like I was always a big fan of JJ's theme, you know, I'm the king JJ. But you've also had Agave on Love, which was the original music. Victor put it together for Yurio to show his more soft side. And then Yuri got Agave Eros, which was like a more sexualized, aggressive, fiery side. And he gave that to Yuri. Agave on Love, man. I've listened to that track a lot. We used to drop that into the podcast back in the day as like a musical fill in between segments. It's one of my favorite anime pieces. I love that song. And that soundtrack is just great. The Dean Fujioka opening, amazing. It's an all-timer. ED's kind of slept on too. It's really, really good. And then having so many great original songs within the anime that are canonically part of that universe. They're all fantastic too.
Yeah, a lot of diegetic songs, right?
That's the word I was skirting around but could not remember.
You did a whole video on that.
We did. It's a 4.0 out of 5. It's a 4 out of 5. Yuri and I, you were born to make history, and you set the bar as the first show on the block. Our second show on the block is from episode 11, and it was Tokyo Ghoul. This was back in October of, I want to say 2017 actually. So I'm actually wrong about Yuri and Ice. That was back in 2017 as well. This is the end of October of 2017. It was our first Halloween-y experience and we had Tokyo Ghoul season 1. For characters, I gave it a 3.5. Taka gave it a 3.5 also. For plot, I have a 4.0. Taka has a 3.5. Visual art was a 3.5 from me and a 3.5 from Taka. Sound was a 4.5 from me and a 4.0 for Taka. Enjoyment was a 4.5 for myself and a 4.5 for Taka, which gives me a score of 20 and Taka a score of 19, which comes out at a score of 3.9. Not quite to the level of Yuri on Ice, but still a very good score, a very positive impression of Tokyo Ghoul season 1. And I remember after watching season 1, just being extremely excited by that universe and the potential of this IP. If I compare this season 1 to great franchises like My Hero Academia, for example, which is coming on later on, I felt like at the end of season 1, they were both in an equally strong place. And I was, if anything, more excited for Tokyo Ghoul than almost anything. And I was so excited to hop into season 2 and just get right into it. And well, obviously the history of Tokyo Ghoul is what it is. And it never really lived up to its promise after the first season. In terms of highlights for me from this one, it's the sound and the enjoyment. All the music from the show is fantastic. Again, it's sort of the same thing as Yuri on Ice. It's got a bunch of great intro tracks and a great OP and ED. It's beyond great OP. It's an all-time OP. I legit think it's the best OP that's ever been put to anime. I think it's probably the most played. Actually, no, it's not my most played anime OP. That would be actually Catharsis, another TK track. That's from Tokyo Ghoul Re Season 2, which is ironically the worst of the Tokyo Ghouls. But Unravel is just such a classic. And then they use that in the show itself at various points throughout the first 2 seasons, and every time that dropped, It was such a swell of emotion. I loved it. And I love that universe. I just thoroughly enjoyed the whole experience. It's hard not to look at it though as a wasted thing, you know, this great debut album, and nothing really ever came close to that again. It's a shame.
Well, it's a shame because we know what comes next. But at the time, like, I was just so blown away. I came into it with basically no expectations, and I was so pleasantly surprised by this show. And like you were saying, I was just really ready to dig into that world and the lore and unpack the magic system and the different factions at war here. And part of that translated into me going and looking into the manga. You know, it's good if somebody goes and looks at the source material, and that's what I did. But as we'll see coming up, it didn't last. It wasn't all sunshine and butterflies. I guess it was never sunshine and butterflies for Tokyo Ghoul.
No.
That wasn't really the aesthetic they were going for, but blood and guts and giant tails coming out of backs.
I guess the thing that sticks out with me with the show, other than the OP obviously, was the incredible last episode, or I guess it's the moment really where Kaneki turns from reluctant ghoul with black hair to OP ghoul, or half ghoul I should say, with white hair. And that whole torture porn episode with Jason, I still regard that as like a work of art.
Yeah, one of the best episodes of anime, period, I think. And, you know, it had reached this fever pitch that I don't think anything could have followed up on. Even if we had gotten a great season 2, it would have felt a little bit like a dip after that. But what we got was just falling off a cliff.
It was falling off a cliff for some of us.
Well, yeah.
Some of us have been on the record to be very forgiving of the numerous shortcomings of the Tokyo Ghoul franchise. And I guess what we're kind of dancing around, you might as well just address.
Yeah, we'll get right to it. The next show on the docket was the very next episode, episode 12 of the podcast, where we covered Tokyo Ghoul Retrograde. So for the characters, you gave it a 2.0 and I gave it a 2.0. Womp womp. Not as good. For the plot, you gave it a 2.5. I gave it a 1.5. For the visual art, you gave it a 3.5. I gave it a 2.5. For the sound, you gave it a 4.5 and I gave it a 3.0. And for enjoyment, you gave it a 3.5 and I gave it a 2.0.
Savage.
Leading to
savage.
Yeah, a pretty big discrepancy in our overall grading, and a final score of 2.7 out of 5 average between us.
Yeah, I was on a 16 and you're on an 11. That's a statement of intent on your opinions on Retrograde.
And you know what? I got to color that a little bit with, at the time, it probably would have been higher. But since watching it and since reacting to it on that episode, I checked out the manga. I had time to think about it. And I went back and, you know, after seeing all of these other shows since then, there are parts of Tokyo Ghoul that I still really appreciated. And then it just made Tokyo Ghoul Retrograde seemed that much worse because it just didn't deliver and it didn't follow up, and I couldn't help lowering my overall impression on it. So the big one here, I think, is plot and visual art and sound and enjoyment. We were about even on the characters, and I think a lot of that was that a lot of the characters that we really cared about from season 1 didn't get the love they deserved in season 2. Most notably Kaneki, but also Toka. There were just so many characters that I was so ready to follow up with. Like, Kaneki had just gone through this massive internal transformation. I wanted more of that. I wanted more from him, and he almost took a back seat for season 2. He was the main character, and he presumably was still the main character, but he just seemed like 10 miles away. He just didn't even matter as much anymore. And then a lot of the characters they introduced ended up either dying or not being important or just being completely flat. So I could totally see why we both were low on the characters.
Yeah, you're right. One of the abiding memories I have from that second run was basically what you said, the absence of Kaneki. I was never the biggest Kaneki guy, but he was the central character and he was holding this thing together. I just imagine like randomly taking Deku out of a season of My Hero Academia, or maybe like Eren from Attack on Titan. But it's almost amplified because season 1 was such a study of his psyche as he transitioned between these two worlds, right? Like a lot of the complexity and the beauty of the original series of Tokyo Ghoul was him sort of fighting his mind and body, right? His body craved flesh, but as a person who still regard themselves as human, he was revolted by the things that his body required to sustain himself. And that was such a key element of Tokyo Ghoul. And a lot of that psychological, I guess like horror for want of a better word, would go on to be replaced by endless action sequences as the season would continue on and progress. And it sort of lost that humanity. And that was kind of emblematic of what was wrong with the season, through the absence of Kaneki. But also Toka, like, she got cut dirty after season 1. She was really relegated to like an afterthought in future seasons. Yeah, it was very, very disappointing. I guess the only upside was we got more Juzo, which is pretty cool. For me, like I was obviously more forgiving than you were. You were in the lower end of mediocre and I was on the upper end of mediocre, but we're still both residing in mediocre, right? And when you get a score of 2.7, that is literally just bang average. And that's basically root of A. And the sad thing is, it's still better than Tokyo Ghoul Re and Tokyo Ghoul Re Season 2. So God only knows what they would have been scored. Actually, speaking of that, Tokyo Ghoul Re Season 1 Part 1, it will come up later on down the line. So that is upcoming. And I'm sure it's going to be savaged. As we move on to the next one, from episode 15, it was One Punch Man. I gave this one a 3.5 for characters, as did Taka. We differed slightly on plot. I gave it a 3.5. Taka gave it a 3.0. Visual arts, we were in agreement, 5.0. Sound, I gave it a 5.0. Taka gave it a 4.5. And enjoyment, I came in at a 5.0 and Taka came in at 4.5. Oh, I'm sorry. I made a mistake there. I actually said characters were a 2.5, not a 3.5. So we were divergent there. Overall, I gave it a 21 out of 25 and Taka gave it a 20.5. So we differed on half a point, but that was good enough to earn One Punch Man a score of 4.15 out of 5. And this show will always hold a special place in the hearts of my anime podcast / reanimator pod, as it was an oft recorded episode. We have canonically one episode based on One Punch Man, but historically there were 3 to 4 instances of us recording episodes talking about One Punch Man. Ironically enough, I would say that the worst of them all is episode 15 of the Reanimator Pods. I don't think that was our best showing in terms of our discussions on One Punch Man, but there's only so much you could talk about One Punch Man, especially when you're repeating the same points.
Yeah, we were driving them into the ground. I still think that releasing that very first episode would be just the sweetest of treats, if that still exists somewhere on a hard drive.
Believe it or not, this is actually, I haven't spoken about this yet. I haven't told you about this, but it existed until about an hour after we recorded the last podcast, when my hard drive basically ended.
No.
It's gone. It's gone. It will not work on my computer. I went to Naraku's place to try and salvage it. Would not work. Went to the big hardware department store here, Nova, for anyone who's living in the city. And yeah, the advice was to go buy a new one and forget about this one.
And all of the precious data that was on it.
And all of the precious data. So what's going to happen is now, over the next couple of episodes as we record this one, you're going to hear maybe some differences in the podcast, because I need to go back and like literally grab everything that's been lost in terms of media files and clips and all this, that and the other. But in terms of the podcast, I managed to save one episode, 102. Everything else is what is available on the internet to you and what is available on the internet to me. So that first episode, while it exists in a place, that place is currently inaccessible. But we'll see what I can do. As of right now, that's not going to be a thing that's going to be on the horizon anytime soon. To One Punch Man, though, this was just a phenomenon. I feel like I've spoken about the show so many times because of the times that we recorded this, but it's hard not to overstate how amazing the show was. Once it got to the visual arts and enjoyment, I just went 5.55. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I remember watching this and just being so staggered. This like might have been the best anime I'd ever seen to this point.
Right. Yeah. It was just a massive blow from the medium itself right to the solar plexus of every single viewer. It was maybe better looking than anything that had come before it for what it was. You know, not a movie, not like a very high production OVA or anything. It was a series. It was a 12-episoder. And it just looked so good.
And it still does. It still does.
Yeah, and it still does. Yeah.
I watched a couple of episodes of One Punch Man for an appearance on the Tuning Japanese podcast talking about Mob Psycho. They were just finishing up a series on One Punch Man, and I was sort of watching as their episodes tugged along, and I just remember being staggered like how good it looks. It's incredible how good it looks. I know it's not been that long. In animation terms, it's been a lifetime, considering how fast animation goes from like that to this. Like if you watch something like Death Note from the late 2000s to now, it's like 14 years later, 15 years later, it looks like it's almost prehistoric. And One Punch Man is as close to Death Note as it is to today, right? It's like somewhere in the middle. And this looks probably better than anything we're going to see this year. That's how incredible One Punch Man is. Like, you know, and obviously it was Madhouse at their glorious best. I could not get over how freaking amazing this thing looks, even now.
It set a new bar for the industry itself.
Yeah.
And the fact that it was like a parody and it looked better than a lot of the stuff it was parodying, or all of the stuff it was parodying. It was something else, something to behold. It kind of set a tone for for our podcast for one, but also for the anime that would follow it up. I don't think there's too much variation here. Like, you put the plot a bit higher, I had the characters a bit higher. That kind of comes down to like, where do you put the humor? Because I mean, let's be real, there wasn't too much of a plot, and the characters weren't like super dynamic, but they were funny, they were memorable, and the plot, it got us from point A to point B, and it had its twists and turns and ropes along the way, but we were here for the jokes, we were here for the humor, and we were here for the visuals.
Absolutely. Speaking of visuals, and speaking of one, a year later, he had another series, and it was Mob Psycho 100.
If everyone is not special, maybe you can't be what you want to be. それぞれの答えにつかる
And so on the very next episode, episode 16, we watched Mob Psycho 100. And here are our scores from today. You gave the characters a 4.0. I gave them a 4.5. You gave the plot a 4.5. And I gave it a 4.5 as well. We both had visual art at 5. You gave the sound a 4.5. I did 4.0. Overall enjoyment, we both came in at a 5. For a total of 23 apiece and a 4.6 out of 5 final rating. This is the highest one yet.
Yes, spoiler alert, it's the highest one for today. Just what a show. I would say everything that One Punch Man excelled at, Mob Psycho excelled at too. And on top of that, the areas where One Punch Man were sort of basic to fine. Middling. Yeah, Mob Psycho just excelled again in that area too. There was no area where it was weak. It was just such a spectacular experience. And the crazy thing about it is, season 2 is even better.
Yeah, my weakest area was sound, and I think the OP I didn't like quite as much.
Both of them suck.
The OP was not great, but the OST, the EDs, everything was fine. It was amazingly voice acted. Love the voice actors who did both Reagan and Mob and Dimple, yes. They were all great. The comedic timing was great. And the visuals, I mean, were different for sure than One Punch Man. Different studio, different flair, but they were just spectacular to look at. Some of the stuff that I saw in Mob Psycho 100 that they were doing with the animation is stuff that to this day I don't think I've ever seen done better. Some of those psychic blast effects where everything just turns into particles, and it was a sight to behold. If you haven't seen Mob Psycho 100, you're really missing out.
There's almost a risk factor inherent in like making a show so idiosyncratic in terms of the visuals. It's either going to make it like something that's truly memorable, in the instance of like Ping Pong, we'll say, for example, where there's nothing that looks like Ping Pong, right? Or there's nothing that looks like Devilman. I know it's both of you asked those shows, but it's true. There's nothing quite like them. And there's nothing that looks like Mob Psycho 100. One Punch Man went for the manga aesthetic more, where I felt like Bones leaned a little bit closer into the original webcomic. They had simpler, more idiosyncratic drawings. There's something more human about them, and there's something more human about Mob compared to Saitama. And it's something we did discuss in that episode back in the day. I'm not going to lie, I was never very proud of our work on Mob Psycho 100. We recorded that the same day as we recorded One Punch Man, and I think there was definitely an aura of lassitude, a little bit tiredness. We tried our best, but it's hard to feign enthusiasm and energy. You either have it or you don't. And for some reason, recording podcasts is kind of a draining experience for whatever reason. I remember towards the end of Mob Psycho 100 just being absolutely spent, and instantly coming out of it just feeling kind of unhappy of how we covered that show. Like, we were effusive in our praise, but I think we could have went a little bit deeper on elements of it. But the show is just incredible. 4.6 says it all. In that instance, you're talking Your Lie in April, you're talking Steins Gate. And I think they're the only two shows that we've created so far that come anywhere close to approximating a similar sort of score. And I'll say right now, I think season 2 might be nearly perfect. I think there's a legitimate case to say that it might be the best anime of the last 10 years. I don't think it is, but I think it's worthy of inclusion in that discussion.
Yeah, in that small, select, upper echelon. All right, let's get on to it. We got episode 19 of our podcast. We covered Erased.
途切れない明日も過ぎてって僕は今日もかきむしって忘れない傷をつけてるんだよもう君じゃないとさ
We did indeed. And for characters, I gave it a 5. Taka gave it a 3.5. So we're quite apart in that respect. Plot, I gave it a 4. Taka gave it a 4 as well. Visual arts, I gave it a 4.0. And Taka gave it a 3.5. Sound design, we agreed with a 4.0. And enjoyment, we agreed with a 4.0. So I came out with a 21.0. And Taka came out with a 19.0, which goes together to form a 4.0. So the same rating that we gave to Yuri and Ice, except for we differed slightly on this one. This one has problems. And I think that's mostly plot related, and how they handled the grand reveal towards the end, and maybe how it landed was probably the biggest issue with the erase. But for the entirety of the flight, I just loved it. I loved it.
Yeah.
I thought the show was really beautiful. I thought it was very different from anything I'd seen before. I loved the characters. I really did love the characters so much. I think Satoru was just such a flawed but perfect protagonist. Kaio, just adorable. I really empathize with her in her struggle. And the mom, just fantastic.
Oh, yeah. See, I like the side characters a lot more. I wasn't super into the Satoru Kaio dynamic. I mean, it was enthralling and I was on board and I wanted to see what happened and I cared about them, but I just didn't find them as interesting as, for example, the mom or even like some of the friends, the childhood friends. Like there were some cool characters. Just felt like none of them were quite as fleshed out as I wanted them to be. And yeah, like the plot suffered from some, I guess, writing themselves into what seemed like a whole, like it was all kind of telescoped and projected what was going to happen. And so it came down to the presentation, which I thought was good. I thought they presented the whole thing, even if it wasn't a revelation. There were some really cool motifs. And this was the first one that we really dug into. And I think that enhanced my enjoyment of it. And that's going to be a trend that I think we'll see going forward, where that enjoyment score for me is higher, or the highest score tied with plot and sound. But it's something where the more you think about it and the more you dig into the choices that were made from the creation standpoint of this show, the more you can appreciate it. I've seen this one at least 3 times now and it didn't get worse. That's something there, right? There is more to chew on than I think a lot of people give this show credit for.
I love the Asian Kung Fu Generation OP, but I think the one that really sticks out with me in this one is one of those rare instances where the ED is actually better than the OP. That cinema ending they have, that was really cool. A1 Pictures, I think they get a bit of a short end to stick because they're so synonymous with Sword Art Online. But man, I thought the production quality in this was really, really excellent. I know you're not the warmest on Satoru and Kaio, but Kaio is probably one of my 10 favorite anime characters, or she was at one time. I don't think she's quite on the My Anime list top 10 favorite characters, but she was at one time, and she's probably orbiting that area, you know? And also Kenya, the best friend, the smart one. I love that name as well, Kenya. And it does remind me of Kenma from Nekoma, which is no bad thing either. And they're both blonde geniuses. Never hurts, never hurts. Next one is special though for me. Special for the podcast as well. It was the introduction of Naraku. I guess the third My Anime podcast member over time. At this point, he must be rivaling Tetsu in terms of appearances. Naraku's definitely become an integral part to the experience. This is him back in his most, I don't want to say toxic, but most hard-headed of days, where he came on and he wrote a couple of articles and he was very inflammatory. Didn't like Shogun Roku at all. Spoiler alert. Shogun Roku, but there was many discussion and content to be mined from his hard-headedness at time. I think he's lightened up a little bit now. He's kind of opened up his horizons a bit more, while still, you know, sticking firmly to his Naraku-ness of thinking that we're softies and we just like everything too much. And he is the voice of hard reason and hard truth. He didn't like Shogun Roku, but we did.
We sure did. All right, Shogun Roku, if you want to hear our full thoughts, episode 22, this is how it breaks down. For characters, we are both sitting at a cool 5.0. For plot, we are both sitting at 4.5. For visual art, we're both at a 4.0. For sound, we're both at a 5.0. And for enjoyment, you're coming in at a 4 and I'm at a 4.5. So for a final score of 22.5 for Yata, 23 for me, and a 4.55 out of 5. This was a heavy hitter.
Man, there was nothing like it. Of all the 10 shows on the list here, and there's a lot of unique shows, this stands alone in terms of, even now, season 1 of Shogun Roku was an experience unto itself. And I think season 2 of Shogun Roku is the best anime I've ever seen. I could not get over the sense of awe after the final seconds of season 2 ended and just being staggered by what I'd seen. It was the most phenomenal thing. There's another thing. I think the acting in this show is the best acting you will see.
Yes.
Just because the challenge to 100%. Do this. They always talk about sub and dub debate and all this. This cannot be done in dub. It can't be done. It has to be experienced in the sub, and that's the only way you can experience it. It's just incredible. Now, I don't think season 1 was quite the feat of brilliance that season 2 was, but it's still a 4.55. Oh man, what a show. What a show.
It's so good. And the only thing that's really lacking from both of our score is in the visual art. And yeah, it's not the most amazingly animated show. The character designs, and I mean, all of the designs were amazing though. These are some great looking scenes. These are some great looking historical backdrops that they're giving us. And it really set the mood. There were full minutes of the show though, where I don't think anything moved except for somebody's face. But while that's happening, like you said, some of the best acting that exists in anime is going on. And you don't need much visuals when you're getting a performance like that. And it's almost all coming from the actors. There's a lot of times very little background noise, diegetic or non-diegetic. But then when they do hit you with the OST, it's just that much more impactful. So yeah, sound off the charts here.
OP is excellent too. It's kind of like it's a low-key one. It's not a banger, but there's nothing about the show that bangs. It's just an experience. And I think the more you are able to immerse yourself in that experience, the better you will receive the show. There's very few things that you would comfortably sort of say is high art and you would put it next to the greatest of things that you've ever seen, or like the greatest movies or the greatest books or whatever. But I feel confident putting Shogun Roku next to anything and not having to make allowances for it. There's no weaknesses, except for, the animation is just not spectacular.
It's not One Punch Man, and we're coming off some of the best animation we've ever seen just on this list. Mob Psycho, One Punch Man, but this just blew them out of the water with everything else. And I think it really cracked open my understanding of the medium, because I think until this point I was of the mind that anime was had this conception of it as something that was thrilling and it was like full of action and it could be cute and it could be funny, but I don't think I'd ever experienced a truly dramatic masterpiece in the medium. And this was it. Like you said, you stack this up next to anything and it'll hold its weight. That's for sure.
Made in Abyss from episode 30. This was another show that got its 4-episode run. And this was when the show really started to pick up momentum. Felt like we had some great episodes discussing Made in Abyss. And I think that's reflected in a very great time for the podcast, I guess, coming into what I felt like was us really finding our feet as a podcast. So for Made in Abyss, episode 30, I gave the characters a 3.0. Taka gave them a 3.0 also. Our plots were both 4.0, so we're agreeing a lot on this one. Visual art was a 5.0. We agreed again. We diverged slightly in sound. We differed. I gave it a 5.0 and Taka gave it a 4.5. And enjoyment, I gave it a 5.0 and Taka gave it a 4.5. So I ended up at a 22, Taka ended up at 21, and Made in Abyss ended up at a 4.3 out of 5. It's hard to really have any problems with Made in Abyss whatsoever. It was all perfectly well executed. The Osamu Masayama background and world design itself was hands down the highlight of the series for me. And since we recorded these series of episodes, I had a chance to explore the manga a little bit more as we were doing that video together on Made in Abyss and the Collective Unconscious. It's amazing to see how much thought and effort went into crafting the world itself, and that's hands down the best part about the show. But it's also aided by the fact that the animation is top tier. This was our introduction to Kevin Penkin. His OST it's beautiful. It really is. This is still his finest work that I've heard from him. Not to say that Shield Hero and Tower of God aren't excellent in their own rights, but this is just great.
It really made the series for me. I think between the backgrounds and the music, there was just more of a feel, a mood, and emotion that was set than almost anything I've ever seen, and it made the whole experience just so immersive. The characters suffered a little bit, I think, because they weren't incredibly deep.
That's almost a pun. You're talking about Made in Abyss.
They got real deep. They didn't get deep enough, though, in my mind. I'm still waiting to talk about Yuri on Ice. I'm still waiting for them to get back to another season of Made in Abyss. I know there have been movies that have progressed the story a little bit further on, but still.
Weekly anime, please.
Get back down there.
Go mining, yeah. If the characters are the weakest element of that, that's something that can be improved upon as the story progresses. And as we get to learn more about Reg and Riku, and Bondru sort of establishes himself more as a villain. I'm excited to see season 2 and season 3 and where this story eventually goes, because season 1 was excellent. I think a 4.33 is a very fair score. It was just a great show, and we were on a run of great shows at this point. We just come off One Punch Man, Mob Psycho, Erased, Shogun Roku, Rocky Shinju, Made in Abyss, hit after hit after hit. You are never disappointed, and I guess that's why we consider ourselves the very positive anime podcast, because it was not a hard thing coming in here week upon week and go, yeah, Made in Abyss turns out it's really good.
Yeah, Yuri on Ice, yeah, Shogun Roku, these things are great.
Speaking of great,
let's move on to our episode 33, which was about a silent voice.
It was indeed Naoko Yamada's silent voice.
This is the first movie making an appearance on this list today. You came in with characters at a 5, and I had a 5 as well. For plot, you gave it a 3.5 and I gave it a 4. For visual art, Yata had a 5 and I had a 5. For sound, we both had a 5 again. For enjoyment, you were in at a 3.5 and I was at a 4. For a total of 22 on your end, 23 on mine, and a 4.5 out of 5. All right, and that puts us at one of our higher scores that we've had today. I mean, all said and done, even including Shogun Roku and Mob Psycho, this was up there, and this made a pretty big impact on us.
I think this might be the second most important movie of the decade behind Your Name, or at least the second most significant movie. It's kind of ironic that they both came out the same year.
What a year, man.
Yeah, what a year. 2016, just a crazy movie. The whole thing is a ride. Now, I felt like the need to justify one of my scores really quickly. Enjoyment is 3.5. That kind of ties into the fact that I have a large problem watching and enjoying large sections of this movie. I find the first half of an hour incredibly hard to watch just because it's so poignant. It just really hurts to watch it. And also, I don't love the final third. I think that's where it falls down for me, is the final act. I don't think it's the complete package the same way Your Name is. And I know the popular opinion amongst less casual anime fans is that A Silent Voice is actually the better of the two movies. I just don't see it like that. I think Your Name is tighter. While it's not the same emotional gut punch that The Silent Voice is, and it's not as beautiful, we'll say, emotionally as Silent Voice is when it's at its best, it's still a tighter construction, and that's why I just have to give Your Name the slight edge. But this was great. This was like a big moment for Naoko Yamada, I think. It's when she moved away from being the girl who did K-On! And she was now Naoko Yamada, right? Like one of the biggest names in the anime industry, who by being attached to a project in and of itself made it worthy of just going to check out. Same way like it would for Kumihiko Ukuhara or Misaki Yase or someone like that, right? Since this had released, she went on to make Liz and the Bluebird, the Sound Euphonium movie. While I don't think it was as good as The Silent Voice, I think it was a very good follow-up. This was not her movie debut. I think her movie debut was Tomoko Lovers, but this felt like the debut, and it was great. Not to cast any shade in Tomoko Lovers. I am of the opinion that Tomoko Market is actually better than K-On! Tomoko Market is so funny. And it's so cute. And K-On! Is so funny and so cute. But I just personally find Tomoko Market to be cuter and funnier. So there you go. I said it. Great movie.
I didn't really factor the difficulty of watching into my enjoyment. I was coming at it a little bit more
subjective,
biased, but I mean, enjoyment is a subjective score. I was just thinking of it as I guess from a creator standpoint, this seemed like a very hard movie to make, and it was impressive. And it was a hard movie to watch too, though. So I can see where you're coming from.
All right, rounding it out for today, we have My Hero Academia Season 1 from episode 38, Tetsu's last official appearance as a full-time co-host. And here are our grades. Characters, we both gave it a 4.0. Plot, I gave it a 3.5. Taka gave it a 3.0. Visual arts is a 5.0 for myself and a 4.5 from Taka. Sound is a 3.5 and a 3.5. And enjoyment is a 4.0 and a 4.0. So we come in at a 3.9 out of 5. So My Hero Academia Season 1 and My Hero Academia in general, it's something we've talked about on the show quite a bit. I think we've had 7 episodes or something like that have been dedicated to My Hero Academia in one way, shape, or form. And at the time, boy howdy, Season 1 was something great.
Oh yeah, it took us by storm.
This is almost a watershed moment for shonen. You obviously had critically acclaimed shonen series, but they were almost like these oddities in a pool you would get every couple of years or whatever. This was like the start of, it felt like every season, be it like Dr. Stone, as you said, or even more recently Jujutsu Kaisen, Demon Slayer, future seasons of My Hero Academia. Crazy time, and this was what kicked it all off.
Yeah, it was the beginning of the end, or the beginning of the next evolution.
The beginning of the beginning,
if you will. Yeah, this one was great. And at the time, I thought it was amazing. And I think one of those ones where my score may have been higher if we graded it right when we watched it. Looking back and looking at further seasons of My Hero Academia, which I thought were a little bit stronger, specifically the next season, Season 2, I thoroughly enjoyed. I thought it was almost better in every aspect.
It is. You think of what you could have done to make Season 1 a little bit better. I could have used a little bit more from Bakugo. I want Season 3 Bakugo, elements of Season 3, where you start to unpeel and realize that he's actually a very well crafted character. I wanted some Todoroki, the Uraraka backstory, all of that stuff that really made the characters pop and made the characters feel special. That was all to come in Season season 2 and season 3. Right now, we were just introducing a series of characters, and at this point, they just weren't fleshed out enough to be considered great. In saying that, though, you could see the potential even early on. Deku was a very sympathetic protagonist. All Might was so charismatic and funny.
Loved All Might right from the beginning, and I think he kind of carried the season.
Easily the best character in season 1.
I only gave this a 4.5, and you gave it a 5 in visual art. Like, it was good. But especially doing these grades now and stacking it up against things like One Punch Man and Mob Psycho and even shows like Silent Voice is in a league of its own because it's a movie. But even things like Made in Abyss, there were just so many heavy hitter 5.0 great visual shows, and I thought that this show was very solid but not in the same tier.
Yeah, I think there was elements, there was moments. The highlight for me is the Nomu Almut fight, the end of the season. The key animator for that battle was Hakuyu Go, who is a Taiwanese animator who at this time was kind of like a nobody. This first season of My Hero Academia is where he made his name, but coming on from here, he did that episode of Fate's Clockrapha. He also did episode 5 of Mob Psycho season 2, which is the best animated episode ever. Oh my god, that thing is incredible. And there was a lot of like web gen names were breaking through with the My Hero Academia. My Hero Academia has only gone on strength to strength in terms of the animation prowess. Just beautiful as always. But a 4.5 that's hardly shade. That's a really high score. That is a 9 out of 10. There's nothing wrong with a 9 out of 10. That's exceedingly good. But it's hard not to remember watching season 2 and season 3 and kind of going, this is a step up. And it's also just the fact that this was 12 episodes, so they didn't have the same time to marinate the same way the other ones would. That's the 10 shows. So the highest of the shows that we graded for today was, I believe, Mob Psycho 100 with 4.6, but there was a lot of high scores there. We rarely dip below a 4 in truth, but don't worry, that'll change as we go forward into Act 2. This little journey took us up to episode 38. We'll do another bunch next time. Until then, for our listeners, I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure if you want to leave any feedback to drop it on social media or drop it on email, myanimePodcast@gmail.com, or hit us up on Discord. The link is on myanimePodcast.com. Until then, for our listeners, bye bye, love you, bye.